I'm going to share a new discovery I made, but first there's a little bit of homework. On January 2nd, I had introduced the comet signed piece that Matthew used to tell posterity that he was also the star, which has a lot of implications for my research. But later on, I learned that there was, in fact, one more comet signed piece in the same newspaper. The first one was on October 13th, 1855, and the next one, which was also the last one, was November 17, 1855. And what he had intended to do was to, I know his style, so I know what he was up to. He was writing this innocuous sounding letter from the country, and then he was waxing eloquent about a storm and a rainbow, and he was kind of being modest about his artistic ability. So he said, well, he decided to do a pen and ink drawing of it and send it in to them, despite the fact that it was a rainbow and full of color. And then that's it. There's no drawing. There's no nothing. And he signs with the comet. Well, I know Matthew's style, and that is that the drawing was the joke. The drawing was the punchline. And whatever was in it may also have had some, might have had stars, or, there was something that was a follow-up to the previous one that had some code in it. Well, they were too cheap to print the drawing that Matthew had done. And I'm sure he was quite disgusted with him, because now it made him look like just a chatty guy from the country that didn't have any point, see? So anyway, there was a second comet, and that was the last one, and I'm pretty sure that's why it was the last one. Now, what I discovered was two novels that Matthew Ghost wrote in 1840. Well, they were published in 45 and 1846, probably written the previous year. And what was going on during that time was that Matthew had been living with his second wife, an arranged marriage, and he couldn't live with her. It was really a mess. So he supported the family from New York City. In the fall of 1844, he went up to New York and he started writing for the New York Tribune with his star signature. All that has been mistakenly attributed to Margaret Fuller. It wasn't Margaret Fuller at all. She was just the literary editor, and he had to slip in whatever he wanted to say that she didn't agree with. And she would sometimes go in and stick her thumb in his work as though it was him, and not even say that it was a different author. So it's not very often, but every once in a while it's her inserting herself in there. But basically all of that for a year and a half is Mathew Franklin Whittier. So this was also the period in very early 1845 that Edgar Allan Poe falsely claimed The Raven publicly. And I've talked about that. That's in my papers. You can get onto Academia EDU, look for my name, and you will find the paper on Edgar Allan Poe. And you can also find that on my website. But that's the period that all this took place. So he was ghostwriting during this time. In 1845, he was ghostwriting for Francis Durivage in Boston, who would later swindle him out of an entire portfolio by apparently getting him to sign a bogus contract along with the guy that fronted the money, George Burnham. That was in 1848, but in 1845, Matthew was ghostwriting for him. I think there were two novels that Matthew ghost wrote, short novels, novelettes. And apparently he was also ghostwriting for a Christian author in New York City named Charles Burdett. And the way this came about was kind of interesting, and it has to do with past life memory. While I was surfing eBay, I came across this newspaper called The Sheet Anchor, and I was very strongly drawn to it. I said, I've got to have a copy of that. I've got to have a copy of that, and I didn't know why. So this edition that I bought, and you can't find them, I mean, it's very rare, but this happened to come up. This is the February 21st, 1846 edition, and I'll also put it up on the screen full size for you. And there's a story on the front page here called The Contrast, and it's continued apparently from the previous edition. And I knew that from a whole bunch of clues, I knew that Matthew had run away from home probably and gone to sea probably around age 14. I don't think it lasted very long. I think his stomach was weak, and they apparently had to drop him off in Cuba and wait for the next ship coming back to take him back. But he did run away to sea briefly, so that shows up in a whole bunch of pieces written by him and also written by his wife, Abby. But here he has a boy going off to sea. And as I read it, I said, man, this feels like Matthew's writing. Both, I'm very well versed in Matthew's style from 12 years of studying it, but also I feel it intuitively. I have the same higher mind. I recognize my work and my style. Sometimes I've been fooled when there's people imitating him, but by and large, and sometimes my preconceptions have blocked me, even though I thought maybe that was Matthew, and then my preconceptions would block me and I talked myself out of it. That's happened. But basically, I recognized my own literary children. And this was a case where I said, I think that's mine. And then I looked it up, and lo and behold, it's attributed to this prolific Christian author named Charles Burdett. And I said, well, that's it. I was just mistaken. And so my intuition and my intellect are fighting. And I went with my intellect and said, okay, I must have been wrong. And I let it go for like a year or two. So just recently, while I was revising my 2 ebooks, kind of going through and re-editing them and cleaning them up, I thought, because I was double checking everything basically. So I said, I better double check this. So I found a page that had links to just about all of Burdett's work. And the first thing I noticed was that although he claims to have been, very much a dedicated Christian author, and that was his, like a missionary sort of, that was his purpose, was to write these Christian novels. Later on in his life, he abandoned that whole market and started writing adventure stories for boys. So apparently the Christian thing was just a market for him. It wasn't really a calling. And then I started looking at the different novels, at the style, and the ones that he wrote are very stuffy and verbose, And then the other ones are extremely well written. So that opened the possibility that Matthew had in fact written this story, because this story came from one of Burdett's books. It doesn't say it did. It's not credited, but that's where it came from. And I'll show a comparison of the exact same part of the story in The Sheet Anchor with the exact same part in this book. So this is called Never Too Late. It was published 1845, and it's a children's Christian, cautionary tale sort of. And, I wouldn't necessarily attribute that to Matthew because, he's the author of satires and, all kinds of things that don't seem to fit. Although I know he was a sincere Christian that his biographers, not having enough information, have missed completely. But I already had this book called Harry Lee, The Tempter and the Tempted. And this was signed with Matthew's own initials, MFW, which I'll put on a screen for you. I'll have to shoot it later. He published this and wrote it and published it in 1863, and this is signed. So there's no question that this is Mathew Franklin Whittier's book. It's a boy's novel, and it's heavily Christian, and it's a kind of a cautionary tale. And the caution is something that was very close to Matthew's own heart, and that was being led astray by one's peer group, which happened to Matthew over and over as a boy, and also later on as a man, a young man and an older man. He would get fooled by people and influenced by people. So he wrote from his own experience, and he wrote this Christian tale. And it's a absolutely precise style match for the 1845 book. So it's, as evidence goes, I'm convinced, it's pretty strong evidence. But my purpose really isn't to prove anything to skeptics, which is a waste of time, really speaking. I'm here to share something that I discovered, which I'm enthusiastic about. So what I'm going to do is read some comparative chapters here, sections. So I'm going to open Harry Lee. And one element that's repeated in this story is that in both stories, we have boys going off to sea. Okay. In this Harry Lee book, he runs away to sea, which is what I believe Matthew did. In the 1845 book, they don't, there's 2 boys that are compared. One of them is Christian and fares well, and the other one doesn't have that upbringing, and he gets into trouble, and eventually he converts and so on. But the one that gets in trouble, he goes to sea, and his mother is very much against it, and he insists on it anyway, and his father, arranges for him to be an officer and so forth and so on. But this is Harry Lee, and it has to do with the runaway. And I just want to show that there's this theme of boys going to sea in both novels. And you can just kind of intuitively listen with your intuitive ear, try to pick up on the fact that this is the same author. The father of Captain St. Clair was a farmer in comfortable circumstances, a Scotchman or something of that sort, who had been in earlier years of a roving disposition and followed the sea, but at length settled down somewhere in New England. He was terribly severe with his boys and kept them hard at work from morning till night, early and late. This is partly autobiographical for Matthew, because his father was severe with the Whittier boys. Nothing vexed him so much as any dissatisfaction among the boys with their lot. Not one of them ever dared mention going to sea to their father, though it was talked over enough among themselves. By some means the boys got possession of an old copy of Robinson Crusoe, which they slyly read. Edwin, the third son, was so delighted with it that he determined, in spite of his father, to start off in search of adventures himself. So, watching his chance, he ran away. And though his father tried every possible way to find him, nothing was heard from him for 15 years. So that's just a start there. This is it's based on real life. You can't really call it autobiographical, but you can say that Matthew is drawing from his own life. So now we're into the 1845 book, Never Too Late. And we're going to see something somewhat parallel. Eugene is getting encouragement from his father that he's going to make him a naval officer. Eugene's eyes sparkled with undisguised pleasure as his father spoke, while Mrs. Rawson could have cried with vexation to hear him. She exclaimed, before Eugene had time to say a word, "Why, Mr. Rawson, you cannot be in earnest," speaking to her husband. "Just think of Eugene going away for 3 years at a time, and who knows what habits or associations he might form in that time." "That is all very well," replied her husband, who seemed to have made up his mind. "But as I cannot expect always to have him near me, I must take care to place him with such a man as will see to that for me." "Oh, father, you need not be afraid of that. I know enough of a midshipman's life to guess what it is, and as I want to go to sea so very badly, I hope you will try and get me an appointment instead of sending me off as a sailor, for I would rather go before the mast than not go to sea, and to sea I am bent on going." "Before the mast," ejaculated the horror-struck mother. "My son, a common sailor, with tarry hands and greasy clothes. I should never survive such a sight. If you must go, why can't your father make you a captain at once? I'm sure he is rich enough to buy a vessel for you," and so on. So we just have the same theme of boys going to sea. Now, there's suffering and poverty depicted in these, suffering at any rate. One of them is poverty and one of them is sickness. And it's handled in a Christian context. So I'm just going to read a little bit from each to show that that theme shows up in both of these novels. This is Harry Lee. Harry has run away and he was badly injured and he's very seriously ill. He's come back and his sister is tending him. The midnight hour had long since passed, and the restless wanderings of the invalid were succeeded by an interval of quiet sleep. For the first time since entering that chamber, the thought of her own weariness suggested the idea of rest. This is a sister. Drawing the large easy-chair noiselessly to the bedside, May threw herself into its cushioned depths. With her eyes fixed upon her brother's pale face, she studied its expression. How much he had suffered, both mentally and physically, was plainly written thereon. White as marble was that brow, and on either cheek the fever fire burned low, lower still, and now it has gone out, cheek, brow, alike death-hued. How oppressive grew the silence. A dreadful fear seized her, and with a nervous movement May drew aside the curtains, and approaching the bedside, pressed her trembling hand upon her brother's moistened brow. She knew there was a change, but what it was to be, life or death. So that's just again, the theme of sickness there. Then we go to the 1845 novel. They struggled on for a few months, pinched by poverty and worn down by overworking, with no prospect of any amelioration of their sad condition. Maria, who was naturally more delicate than either of her sisters, soon found her health giving way under the tremendous tasks imposed upon her. But when she saw the pale cheeks, the sunken eyes, and wasted form of her loved Irene, thus wearing away her youthful days in wretchedness and misery, she could not complain, but suffered on in silence. She felt that her strength was sadly overtasked, and that she could not much longer survive it, but the prospect of death had no terrors for her, while she raised her heart to God in devout gratitude for all the unnumbered mercies which had been so bountifully bestowed upon her in her earlier days. She bowed meekly to the adversities with which they were now visited, and submitted in humble, trusting confidence to her lot, and so on. So you can see suffering approached from a Christian perspective. There's much more in the other book from that point on about Christianity. As a matter of fact, in this 1863 book, Matthew has the young man who's maybe dying, has him have a dream which basically is a near-death experience, and it has a whole bunch of the elements of a near-death experience in it, and then he recovers afterwards. So Matthew was well-versed in spiritualism and knew about near-death experiences and put one into his novel. Now, here's the conclusion from the 1863 book. It's the chapter that starts conclusion. It was the month of June, when everything in nature wears its holiday suit. The grass lay thick and green upon the fields, with June blossoms sprinkled thick upon its wavy surface, and the old elm trees hung with thickest foliage, nodded and whispered knowingly as a bridal party, sweeping past, moved toward the old church upon the hill. A nearer view reveals the faces of the party, and we recognize our old-time friends. The bridegroom, Captain Edward Lawrence, well has won his honors, and our gentle May deserves the fond devotion which reveals itself in every glance of his which rests upon the gentle being at his side. It is not so easy to recognize in that form erect and face aglow with health and happiness the pale face and crippled form of Harry Lee, but so it is. With hardly a vestige of his old lameness remaining, he had returned to his home, his heart overflowing with gratitude to him who, under God, first gave him hope and opened the way for his recovery, and so on. So again, it's the recovery of the sick person, which is couched in a Christian context. Now, in 1846 and 1847, Matthew wrote for a humor magazine called Yankee Doodle there in New York. That was the first humor magazine in America, patterned after Punch in Britain and Cruikshank's Almanac. And he did a whole series about the condition of women who were trying to eke out a living doing sewing and things like that. He had several occupations. Each chapter, each installment was a different occupation, and he tried to bring their plight to the attention of the city of New York. So he's done the same in this novel, basically, because he has his characters who fell on hard times through no fault of their own, reduced to eking by sewing and gradually falling into poverty in a desperate situation. So this was Matthew, the social reformer. His social reform work goes all the way back to 1830 and a novel in 1834. That novel has been mistakenly attributed to his editor because he published it anonymously, and his editor apparently helped him publish this series. So Matthew was writing this kind of social reform novel as early as 1833, 1834. It's before Dickens, obviously before Dickens published A Christmas Carol, but it's before Dickens was basically doing anything of the sort. Matthew was writing in this vein, as I recall. I'd have to look up Dickens' timeline, but I mean, in 1830, Dickens wasn't publishing, I don't believe. And in 1830, Matthew was writing when he was editing the New York Constellation for its editor-in-chief, Asa Green. He was writing this same kind of material against debtor's prison in particular. See? So anyway, I'm convinced that these two novels at the very least were Matthew's. There's one more that was for sale that comes from the same year, 1845, that's listed as having been written by this same Charles Burdett, and I can't find it anywhere. It has to do with an orphan and training children up in Christianity, and I can't find any sign of it anywhere on the internet. So it was only $20, so I bought it, and we'll see. I figure that it may be Matthew's, in which case I'll recognize it by style. If it's not, if it's clearly a different style, then we can prove that Burdett was in fact having people ghostwrite for him. See, that it wasn't all the same author being published under his name. So either way, it should be evidential, one way or the other. And if it's particularly interesting, I'll hop back on here and present that when it comes in. Might be a couple weeks. So that's all. I just wanted to present these. I don't have a physical copy of the other one. The other one is introduced by someone who, in the first person, who claims to be a reporter in New York City and talks about all of the horrible things that he sees in the course of a day as a reporter. Well, Mathew was, in fact, a reporter in New York City in 1834-35, writing the arraignment hearings for Asa Green's third paper, the New York Transcript. So he wrote that from experience. But when you get into the book, it's narrated first person by somebody else who happens to be a merchant who owns a store. Well, Mathew was also pursuing a mercantile career at the same time. That's why he wrote a book called The Perils of Pearl Street, which people also think was written by Asa Green. It was part of that same series in 1833, 1834. So Mathew was pursuing a mercantile career, probably working for a trading company, probably started out clerking for a store there, at the same time that he was editing the Constellation and later on wrote for the New York Transcript. So much of Mathew's work is loosely autobiographical. Once you know what to look for, you can find his own personal life embedded in all of these fictional works. And it's not point for point, but you can ferret it out. You can figure out, what he's embedding of his own personal life in these stories. So both of these novels, the first one here is called Never Too Late. The second one is called Lilla, A Story of New York. And I have a digital copy of that. I'll put a little something on the screen from the title page or whatever, but I don't have a physical copy of it yet, just keeping an eye out for it. And there's other discoveries I've made recently, but I think these are really the most interesting ones.